Hello and welcome to the Ellen Made Book Club and my wrap-up of the Diversity Book Bingo 2025. The Diversity Book Bingo is a reading challenge that I hosted for the first time in 2025, and I'm hosting it again in 2026. So I will leave all of the links in the description box to the announcement video and the Storygraph challenge and the Discord server. You're very welcome to join in. The aim of the challenge is for me to diversify my reading and hopefully, help you do the same in a fun way. This video is hopefully going to serve three purposes. I wanted to, one, just be a wrap-up of my experience of this reading challenge and I want to tell you what books I read for the different prompts. Number two, I wanted to be a source of book recommendations if you are planning to participate in the challenge 2026, or if you just want some, diverse books to read. And third, I want this video to be helpful for you if you are planning to participate in the 2026 challenge, because I know some people find it a bit complicated and it is a little bit more complex maybe than some other reading challenges, but it's not really that complicated, and I hope that this video can show you how you can interpret some of the prompts and how you can be a bit strategic to make it not so complicated, hopefully. So if you're new to this challenge, it's basically a bingo board with 25 prompts, and some of them have a little bit more depth to them, like a theme. Others are just kind of basic, like read a book from the library, which could, be any book. But then there are diversity representation prompts and also continents that sort of go into the books that you read for the bingo. So all the books that you read for this challenge should place somewhere on the bingo board, but to get a bingo or a blackout, you also have to fulfill all of the diversity prompts and all of the continent prompts within those 25 books that you put on the bingo board. And you don't have to read 25 books to complete the challenge. That is just to get a blackout board, but that blackout board won't count unless you also fulfill the diversity prompts and the continent prompts. Those are the foundation of this. And the reasoning behind that is that I don't want to put one prompt on the bingo board that says read a book by a BIPOC author or read a book by a queer author. I want you to read as many books by people of color as possible, or as many books by queer authors as possible. And I want to encourage intersectionality, so that you're reading maybe a book by an author who has a disability and also is part of a minority, or maybe a book by an author from an African country who is also queer. And what does that mean? And what happens when you combine these different things? So that's why they're not separate prompts on the bingo board, but they are meant to infuse every book that you read for the challenge. They don't have to infuse or be a part of every book on the bingo board. You can count any book on the bingo board, just as long as you somehow fulfill all of the diversity prompts and the continents prompts. So that being said, if you are participating in the 2026 challenge, my number one tip would be to start with the most difficult prompts on the diversity representation list and the continents list. You don't have to read that book first if you don't want to, but strategically, it's smart to start planning and collecting some options for those prompts. So if you know that you don't read a lot of books from African authors, which I know is the case for a lot of people, I would start by, scouting out some titles from Africa and making sure that you have some of those, because you're not going to have to work very hard to find a book set in North America or by a North American author. So if you start by picking out some books from the continents that you don't read a lot from, and for the diversity representation prompts that you don't read a lot from, then it's not going to be so complicated, and you're also not going to end up with 3 squares left on the bingo board and then Africa, Asia, South America, disability, and neurodivergence left to fulfill, because that's when it's going to be difficult. So that's my number one tip. And now let's get into the books that I read for this challenge in 2025. I did read 25 books for this challenge, or I counted 25 books for the prompts on the bingo board. And so I just want to go through each prompt one by one and tell you which book I counted for that prompt, and also what continent and diversity representation that book counted for. I'm not going to get into too much about each book just because that would be a very long video. I will put a star rating, and I will also tell you something about the book and how it fit the prompt and how it fit the continents or diversity prompts. The first prompt on the bingo board is new to you country, so to read a book from a country that you haven't read from before. And for this I chose The Queens of Sarmiento Park by Camila Sosa Villada. This follows a group of trans sex workers in Argentina, and they discover and raise a baby. This counts for the continent of South America, and it also counts for queer rep, as the main character and the whole group of characters basically are trans women, as is the author. The next prompt is laughter, and for that I counted My Sister the Serial Killer by Oinkan Braithwaite, which is a darkly comic novel set in Nigeria, and so this counts for the continent of Africa. The next prompt was for another reading event. That could be a booktube event, a book club read, or a buddy read. And I counted Homegoing by Ya Jazzy for this prompt because I buddy read this with Chelsea at Libraries and Lattes. This starts out with two sisters in Ghana, one of which is sold into slavery in the US, and the other sister stays in Ghana and is married to a slave trader. So we follow these two lineages in the family, and the book itself spans generations up until present day. I counted this one for Africa and North America, and it also has minority representation. The next prompt was to read a memoir or a biography, and for this one I counted We Will Be Jaguars by Nemonte Nkimo. This is a memoir of Nemonte's experience as a Waorani woman in Ecuador, and her experience growing up and with missionaries coming to their area, and how that affected her worldview, and then later in life how she is taking on big oil companies to save the rainforest in that area and to fight for the rights of the indigenous peoples who live there. This counts for the continent of South America, and it also has indigenous representation, which is also a minority, so it counts for both of those prompts as well. The next prompt was to read a book with a feminist theme, and for this one I counted The Chain by Shimen Suleiman. This is also a memoir, and it focuses on the author's experience of an abusive relationship with a man, and also what happens after that relationship is over and how she connects with other women that this man has had relationships with. I listened to this on audiobook, and the author is a spoken word poet, and she narrates this memoir herself, which definitely added to my reading experience. I counted this for the continent of North America because the story, or this memoir, takes place in North America, where the author lived, at least during this period. She is originally from the UK, I think, and of Turkish descent, so she is also representing a minority, and that also comes into play in this memoir a bit. So it counts for North America and minority. The next prompt was nonfiction, so simply to read a work of nonfiction. For this one I counted Disability Visibility, which is an anthology edited by Alice Wong, who sadly passed away in November of last year. She was a disability rights activist, and so her passing is obviously a huge loss to her loved ones, but also to the disability community as a whole. So yeah, it was very sad to hear that. I am very glad I read Disability Visibility though. I think that is a fantastic anthology and one that everyone should read. It only counts for the continent of North America, but on the diversity representation list, it fulfills every single prompt. The next prompt on the bingo board was to read a recommended book, and this could be a personal recommendation or just a general one of a prize-winning book or something that you read about in the paper or whatever. And for this one I counted Women Talking by Miriam Taves. This started out as kind of a general recommendation, I've just seen it everywhere and heard good things about it. But then I also got a personal recommendation or like a personal endorsement in a comment from Becca at Read Becca. She loved it, and so I'm gonna take that as my personal recommendation. So thank you. And yeah, I loved it. This follows a group of women in a Mennonite community as they try to figure out how to get out of a very dangerous and harmful situation. This takes place in Bolivia, I believe. It's in South America at least, but the author is Canadian, and the only way that South America plays a part in the story is as a way of isolation, and like the story itself is in a very isolated setting. It could be anywhere as long as it's foreign to them. So I didn't count this for any continent, but I am counting it for the minority prompt as it is representing the Mennonite community. Next prompt is secondhand, and that was simply to read a book that you bought secondhand or got secondhand, like a hand-me-down book. I bought this in a thrift shop. It is Oil on Water by Helen Habila, which is set in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, and talks about how the oil industry has affected the environment and the people who live there. It's kind of a thriller within that, but it's not a lot of thriller, I would say. I'm glad I finally got to this, and I'm counting it for the continent of Africa. The next prompt was island, so to read a book about life on an island, I chose to read Annie John by Jamaica Kincaid, which is set in Antigua, where the author grew up. It's a coming-of-age story, and it's quite short, and I'm counting it for North America. The next prompt was future empowerment, which was to read any book that could provide you with something that would help you, or like teach you something, or like something that you could learn from and be empowered for your future. I listened to ADHD for Smartass Women by Tracy Otsuka. This counts for the continent of North America and for neurodivergence. The next prompt was library, so to read any book from the library, and for this one I counted The Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is a short little nonfiction book about the sort of gift economy of nature, like how nature provides gifts, and everyone in nature, like animals and plants and stuff, there's a reciprocity there. Is that the word? And so yeah, the book talks about how we can use that as humans. This counts for the continent of North America, and it also counts for indigenous peoples, which are also a minority, so it also counts for that. The next prompt was animals, so to read a book where animals play a part in some way, and for this one I counted Endling by Maria Riva. This has a lot of different themes, but one of them is endangered species, and specifically snails. This takes place in Ukraine, so it counts for the continent of Europe. I'm also counting it for queer rep, since the main character is asexual. At least that's how I read it. It's not explicitly said, but I think that it was clear enough for me to count it, and I think it's something that isn't seen a lot in books, and so I wanted to highlight that. It could also count for minority in terms of the author being of Ukrainian descent, living in Canada, but the story doesn't really take place there, and even though there is like some mentions of that experience of being in the diaspora as this war is going on, I decided not to count it, but like you could if you wanted to. I decided not to. The next prompt was to read a 2025 release, and I read a lot of those. I read a 25 new releases last year, and I made a video of that, so I will have that linked if you want to check that out. But I counted for this prompt Red Clay by Charles B. Fancher. It's based on the author's own family history, and it follows a boy who is born into slavery. The story takes place sort of at the end of the American Civil War and as slavery is coming to an end. So this counts for the continent of North America and minority. The next prompt was a 5-star read, so any book that you gave 5 stars throughout the year could count for this prompt, and I decided to count Pet by Catherine Chidgey, which was one of my favorite reads last year. This is a literary thriller, and it follows a girl in school and her charismatic teacher. The author is from New Zealand, and the story is also set in New Zealand, so this counts for the continent of Australia, or Oceania. There is also an aspect of this story which has to do with minorities and racism, so you know, you could count this for a minority if you really wanted to. It is part of the story, but I wouldn't say it's the main part, and it's also not own voices, so I decided not to count it for this one. The next prompt for the bingo was to read a book that fit a prompt on someone else's list, and I partook in a lot of reading challenges last year, which I also did a wrap-up video of and will link. One of those was the Buzzword Challenge by Kayla at Books and Lala, and I decided to count The Old Woman with the Knife by Gu Byung Mo. This fit the prompt to read a book with in the title for the title Buzzword Reading Challenge, but I think I counted it for the knife, like to have a weapon on the cover. This is a darkly comic thriller, I would say, by a Korean author and set in Korea. It is also translated by Chi Young Kim, and yeah, it counts for Asia. The next prompt was a comfort read, and this one definitely fulfilled that for me. It's Ronja Rövardotter by Astrid Lindgren, Ronja the Robber's Daughter. This is a children's story, or like middle grade fantasy novel, or like magical realism kind of. I don't know. It's one of my childhood favorites, very nostalgic for me, and I loved reading it this time around as well. It doesn't really have a lot of diversity representation, but it's set in Sweden, so it counts for the continent of Europe. The next prompt was to read a book and also watch the adaptation of the book in any form, TV show, movie, play, whatever. Graphic novel could also work. I counted Heartstopper by Alice Oseman for this prompt, so it's already a graphic novel, but I decided to watch the adaptation of it, the TV show, or like the Netflix show. It was a bit like too close together for me to like watch the whole thing, but I think I watched like 2 episodes or something, and I counted the first volume of this series. This one is set in Europe, so it counts for the continent of Europe, and it also has a lot of queer rep. The next prompt was mental health, so to read a book that either has a theme of mental health in the book, or can serve to benefit your own mental health, whether that be like a self-help book or just a book that makes you feel good. And I decided to read a book that was not a feel-good story at all, but it has representation of mental health, and that was Crooked Seeds by Karen Jennings. This takes place a couple of years in the future in South Africa, and there's a drought and there's a water shortage and a murder, and it's all very miserable and horrible, and yeah, it's not a fun read at all. The main character has an amputated leg, like below the knee, I think, and she's also dealing with depression, I would say. So there's, you know, physical and mental disability in this story. I thought this was an interesting read, and it's very well written. It's not one that I would necessarily recommend just because it is very miserable. If you enjoy miserable books, I would say this is a good one, but maybe check some trigger warnings. The next prompt on the bingo board was to read a backlist book, so any book that is not the latest release by an author. And for this one, I counted Idol Burning by Rin Usami, translated from the Japanese by Asa Yoneda. This follows a girl who is obsessed with her idol, and then this idol has kind of a fall from grace, and that's basically all there is to this little book. But yeah, it counts for the continent of Asia. The next prompt was to read a short story or a short story collection, like anything short will count, and I went with Murder by Memory by Olivia Waite, which is like a novella, I guess. It's a sci-fi mystery, kind of a queer Miss Marple in space story. It doesn't count for any continent since it is set in space, but it does have queer rep, so it counts for that prompt. The next prompt was migration, so to read a book where there is a theme of migration somehow. I decided to go with Fundamentally by Naseba Yunus. This follows a woman who gets a job via the UN to work in Iraq, de-radicalizing ISIS brides. And this is maybe not the like typical migration story. It's not like an immigrant experience and that whole thing, but I think it shows a lot of different types of migration and a lot of different reasons why people move countries. There is the main characters, and I think also the author's parents leaving Iraq as refugees to the UK. And then there is moving countries for a job, as the main character does. And then there's also a lot of women migrating to this area to support ISIS and like that whole migration. And then there's also this like push-pull with the ISIS brides, like getting them out of there and like trying to convince them to leave Iraq. And so yeah, there are a lot of different ways that migration plays a part in this story, which I think is very interesting. I will also mention, because I think this is a very important part of, you know, diversity as a whole, but like for this challenge as well, I watched a video by the Candid Book Club, which is a channel that I highly recommend, and you can go and watch the video. I will leave that in the description, where they talked about their least favorite books and the most favorite books of the year. And this one was one of their least favorites, and at least in part because of how they found Muslim women represented or like portrayed in this book. I thought that was very sad because that's not what I got out of it. I read this book and I felt like it was making so much fun of aid and like people working in aid and like this whole like savior thing, and like white people mainly, how messed up things are. And like even when people want to do well, somehow the system is just so hard to work within that things just start going all kinds of wrong directions. And that is very sad and tragic and horrible in real life, but it also makes for dark comedy. And so that's the part that I enjoyed about the book. I just wanted to mention that, so that if you do pick this one up, maybe have that in mind and just know that that's not an accurate representation of all Muslim people, if any. Let's move on to the next prompt, which was to read a book in a genre out of your comfort zone. I don't even know what genre this would be, but it's classified as sort of fantasy horror, both of which are out of my comfort zone. So I picked up Never the Wind by Francesco Dimitri. This follows a boy in Italy who is losing his eyesight, and so it counts for the continent of Europe and also for disability. The next prompt was to read a book by a favorite author, and for this one I counted My Friends by Friedrich Backman. This has been talked about a lot this previous year, so I won't get into what it's about. It's got art and found family and like friendship and a dual timeline kind of story. Emotional roller coaster is how I would describe it. I'm counting it for the continent of Europe since the author is from Sweden. I don't think he lives here anymore, or like right now, but he is very much a Swedish author. And also his stories are written in a way that they could kind of take place anywhere in sort of a similar climate. So it's a bit hard to pinpoint exactly where it's set, but I'm gonna go with Sweden. It feels very much like a Swedish environment, so I'm gonna count it for Europe. You could also count it for queer rep, since there is a little bit of that in the story. It's not really a main part of the story, I wouldn't say. And also, as far as I know, the author isn't queer himself, so I didn't count it for that, but like you could. The next prompt was to read a prize winner. Any prize or award will do. The Nobel Prize, the Goodreads Prize, the BookTube Awards, whatever. I decided to count Displacement by Kiku Hughes, which won some kind of award. This is a young adult historical graphic novel, which I think is based on the author's own family history, and it's about these internment camps in the US for Japanese Americans during the Second World War. So it counts for the continent of North America, and then it also has minority and queer representation. And then the final prompt was to read a book in translation, nonfiction or fiction, which I have already mentioned a couple, but I counted Crooked Plow by Itamar Vieira Jr. for this one. This is translated by Johnny Lawrence, and this is a Brazilian novel written by a Brazilian author. It's historical fiction and like literary historical fiction, I would say, and it follows two sisters of African descent, and it's sort of looking at the aftermath of slavery in Brazil, which I had very little insight into, and so this was a very interesting read from that aspect as well. But the story starts out with the sisters finding this knife under their grandmother's bed, and they start putting it in their mouth, and so one of the sisters ends up cutting off her tongue. It counts for the continent of South America. It also has minority representation and disability representation. So to wrap this up, I did get a blackout board, and I did fulfill all of the diversity representation prompts as well as all of the continents. If I counted correctly, I've read books for this challenge from 16 different countries, which I think is pretty awesome. I do have like at least 2 from each of the continents and each of the diversity representation prompts. The one that I have the least representation of is neurodivergence, which I only have 2 books for, and the continent of Australia or Oceania, which I only have 1 book from. So those are areas where I can improve in 2026, or just, you know, 1 is enough. So like if you just have 1 from each continent and 1 from each diversity representation prompt, that's good enough. It's just my head, that's, you know, I just want there to be 5 of each because that would be an even spread, equality all around. But I'm still happy with the books that I have read and, you know, fulfilling all of these prompts. And yeah, I found some really good reads for this challenge. So overall, I'm very happy. I hope that you found some inspiration or like got a better sense of how you can play the bingo if you want to participate, or just found some book recommendations that you find interesting. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments and I will answer them there. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. This is a short little nonfiction book about the gift and like what? I chose to listen to Smartass Women. What's it called?